Morning, folks. It is Friday, May 9th. We are working on S-127. The plan right now is we are going to have John walk us through the amendments that we drafted based on yesterday's whiteboard and conversation. We are not going to discuss it. We're just going to walk through it so we can understand it, and then we're going to go to the floor. And then after the floor, we are going to have a discussion to try to finalize language. And then likely continuing that this afternoon. There's, I guess in the case of the minor miracle that we completely finish the bill before lunchtime, we'll go to a special education joint hearing with the education committee, but I feel like that's probably unlikely. And so we'll continue our work this afternoon. We do need to finalize our language by the end of the day so that John can have everything he needs to offer us a clean copy so we can vote at 9 a.m. on Tuesday before the floor. So that means that we all need to be here at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. Is that okay for everyone? Great. Okay. And with that, John, floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Close to the right size. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through the sets of changes from the whiteboards that I looked at last evening after you guys had departed. So on page 1, we're starting with updates to the affordable housing definitions. This was a construct that I had discussed with Chris Donnelly about another existing concept for affordable housing to build in housing subsidy covenants. So what you see here is affordable housing. That's housing that's subject to a housing subsidy covenant as defined in 2017, say 610 of perpetual duration. And so that picks up existing housing subsidy covenants that are used to produce either time limited or perpetual.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. Anyone who's missing the whiteboard, I took pictures of it and I'm happy to send those pictures to any. Is that what you're looking for, Mark? Okay. Yep.
The revised board.
Okay. Then Jim did that this morning based on conversations, but I don't.
No, it's fine.
Okay, great. I will send that to you.
And the first request as I had it and what this is responsive to is affordable in perpetuity. So that's what this is. And you'll see here, this is a meaningful difference for affordable housing development. It's a housing development of which at least 20% of the units are affordable housing units. You may recall from sometime this week that when I talked about the Title 24 definition, the affordable housing development definition includes the greater of 20% of units or 5 units. So it had a minimum 5-unit cap, but if you had a small building that you were producing housing in, that would mean necessarily you might have to have quite large percentage of that. So this just says housing development of which at least 20% of the units are affordable housing units. You don't have that minimum 5 units required. The next change we're going to come to is the definition of improvements. You're not going to see highlighted here because what has been changed is a removal. But previously, the first clause of this installation or construction of kinds of infrastructure referenced power or telecommunications infrastructure. So that's been pulled out. And what you now have is this list, this exhaustive list of infrastructural improvements, wastewater, stormwater, and the like that we talked about yesterday, public roads, sidewalks, streetscapes.
That's a good question. When you say public roads, streets and bridges, is that publicly owned also streets and bridges? Does the public modify streets and bridges?
So I don't think so. And here's why. This also came up when this concept was discussed in House Commerce. We have public called out in particular places, right? So if it was meant to modify all of them, I would attach them to all of them or only to one of them. So I agree. If you want to say that these are all public, I would specify that. Although you might note that you're building infrastructure for, there may be private roads involved in leading into a housing development or the like. But yes, I think you would want to have public attached to all or just put one. That was key. The other thing I would flag here is I left this language because I wasn't sure if there was intent to delete this, but I do have it highlighted in green. The direction I saw on the board was to tighten improvements, remove the utilities, which is that power and telecom infrastructure. I wasn't sure if folks also wanted to remove the site preparation piece that I think of as a separate bucket, right? Covers plastic infrastructure, and then your site preparation. So just flagging. We have a new purpose section, and there's something I will flag about this. So this came from the auditor's office. The purpose of the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program is to support the development of new primary residences that would not be created, but for the infrastructure improvements funded by the program. Very intuitive concept. One of the things that I would call out here is the purpose as came across from the Senate, and as we've been talking about up to this point, also had a link to that households of lower moderate income. You don't have the same call out here. We obviously do have provisions built in throughout the subchapter that speak to the affordability piece, but you might consider whether you want to have a similar qualifier here, right? New primary residences for households of low to moderate income or something to that effect.
I think probably we would.
Yep.
Thanks.
The next change we have, what constitutes the housing development site? There had been a comment yesterday, or a request to tighten up what the site is. The concept from yesterday was that you had where the construction of the housing development occurs and any immediately contiguous parcels, so immediately adjoining parcels. This tightens up that site. It's just the housing development site is the parcel or parcels on which that housing development is installed or constructed and nothing else. It doesn't include the surrounding parcels. One effect of this, of course, is that you now have a smaller geographic site on which that is set. So it does affect the increment that would be generated. That was the,
I do have a question. What if there's a pipe that has to go from one place to the housing site?
there can be geographic separation between where the infrastructure is installed
Okay.
and where the housing development is. So the infrastructure itself doesn't affect what constitutes the housing development. The housing development site is just about the housing development and not the infrastructure.
Okay.
That could be on the site, but they don't have to be.
All right.
Yeah, so practically speaking, the impact would be to reward places that were truly investing in housing.
There's a way to think of this as tightening it to saying that you're only going to get the increment from the property on which you're doing the development, which is, I think, what the question is, instead of getting accidental or nearby appreciation purely by the fact that you happen to be situated next to that parcel. Yep. I did just want to flag, because some of the concerns that were written on the board were already present in the draft, so I will try to flag some of those. So for instance, primary residence in perpetuity, we have this built into the housing infrastructure agreement part. So that's what these lines are, so that we are covering that piece. And just to speak to the affordable in perpetuity piece, that's built into your definition, right? That's the housing subsidy covenants under that Title 27 definition are required, and the definition spells out it's in perpetuity. So those are picked up in the definition. And if you're meeting the criteria, then those covenants would be built into what you're doing as an affordable housing development. Okay, we're coming to the actual project application section. There's some substantive changes here. So one thing is that we've shifted a bit what the board is proposed to do in this concept. And you'll recall that yesterday, the day before, I can't recall, BEPC had to approve the but-for test in addition to these process requirements, the project criteria and the location criteria. And there was this alternative route that if you couldn't meet the floor area threshold, that you would have just that one determination if you contribute meaningfully to the housing needs of the community would be sent off to this chip board. They would make that determination, and otherwise BEPC would handle every other part of the process. Slight change here.
And before you get into this,
Yes.
I just want to say, I think this is the place that Representative Kimball and I did the most, like, innovating outside of this room. And so I want to name that, because most of this was us just trying to fully communicate the conversations that we had when John was out of the room. And so what we were thinking was that we had a number of flags about how VEPC doesn't, for no fault of their own, it's just what VEPC is not constructed for understanding planning and zoning issues. It's not constructed for understanding housing issues. And since that's the bulk of the project idea here, it made sense to have, and we were concerned that CHIP both had too much to do and not enough to do. That we would have them say, like, this is a housing project and is the right place. And then the increment conversation could happen with VEPC, which is where their bailiwick is. So John will explain how that works, but that's what our thinking was. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, can you clarify the hierarchies?
Yeah, I think John will do that part.
So the way to think of it is the application is still housed within BEPC, but there is a determination that's required from CHIP. And unlike the previous concept, which was a one-off determination upon request, this would be each application is going to require the board under this subsection C, which I'll show you here. So board review, the CHIP board shall review each application to determine two things: whether the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907, similar to the concept that you had before. But they're also going to conduct the but-for test. That's what this language is. So you're not seeing highlighting here because you already had the but-for test in the draft. But instead of having Betsy conduct that but-for test, this has the CHIP board conduct the but-for test. The one thing I would note here is that but-for test, while it does look to housing pieces, right? How would that housing be affected by having the financing? How would it affect the number of units of affordable housing and the like? It does require them to look at additional revenue created in their financial aspects of what they're looking at. But when we come to the composition, hopefully that will help address any concerns that may happen on that point. So this determination has to happen each application. The board reviews purposes and the but-for test. BEPC does not have to conduct the but-for test for these. It's the board that does this.
Yeah, just a clarification. So the way mechanically this works is that we've incorporated this draft, the but-for test has been incorporated into the purpose. So by referencing that here.
Sorry, it's not,
But-for test?
there is a but-for statement in the purpose section, you're correct. But the outright but-for test is a specific set of considerations that have to be undertaken. And they are what's outlined here in like the subdivisions 1, 2, 3. So when the board is conducting the but-for test, they'll have to look at the purpose to make the purpose determination, but they also separately have to conduct this specific test, which is outside the scope of the purpose.
And to further clarify, if we modify that additional purpose to specify affordable housing, then that would be
Picked up
picked up in here.
necessarily. Yep, that's right. Otherwise, the process remains the same for BEPC. This would be a reduced determination they have to make, right? They don't now have to make any but-for test determination. They still have to conduct the process requirements, which we've talked about before. I will just note, because there've been a lot of conversations about the in perpetuity pieces of this. If you wanted to spell out as part of their review of the housing infrastructure agreement, we've talked about how that needs to adhere to the standards of section 1909. You could be even more explicit on that front. You could say, and confirm that this, and this are included, but it should be picked up by this that adheres to. But if you were concerned on that front, you could be even more prescriptive or more direct. You do see now, as a consequence of moving that but-for test and the purpose determination by the board up to that subsection C, BEPC's project criterion is now a sole project criterion that it has to look to. It just asks one question. They review the housing infrastructure project application to determine whether at least 65% of the floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing. So they just check a floor area requirement, and that's what they need to check for their project criterion. A couple things to note here: substantive differences in the actual criterion. One is the 65%. You guys have been moving between a couple numbers, 50, 70. You got a new one. The other thing is just to call out, we have this generic language floor area. You've seen gross floor area. You've seen a novel concept for how to not have gross floor area. What we'll see when we come to the rulemaking section is tasking BEPC with determining what the appropriate category of floor area is. Okay. I'm going to talk about the location criteria when we come to the end of the draft, because there is a future effective expansion to the location criteria. It just wouldn't be in effect at the immediate onset of the program. All right.
Change in the membership of CHIP, did you go through?
It'll come later.
Okay, sorry.
And I'm just realizing now I need to update, depending on how this goes, this title. But this is your tax increment retention limits. We had that per county set yesterday. And now we have a new concept based on some of the discussions with both Pat and Julia yesterday. BEPC shall not approve pursuant to the subchapter an annual amount. So it's an annual, this is not over the course of the program, an annual amount of education property tax increment retention greater than 14 million, which is the amount that would have resulted in a uniform rate increase of the statewide property tax rates in FY25 of that 1 cent on the $100 of equalized education property value rounded to the nearest million. So you'll have seen yesterday that was basically 13.9, and it's been rounded to 14 mil. So it provides outright the figure. You could have the calculation set up here, but that would require Pepsi to duplicate the pieces. So I think there's a nice side to just outright saying what the figure is and then explaining what it does. But consider an alternative, which is that you could have the calculation and it could be done each year so that it would vary based on what the tax rates are. But note that if you're transforming the education transformation system, if you're changing your property taxes at the same time, we might then have to tweak what this language is to call out what the change is.
Representative Holcomb.
So just two questions to try to understand this language. First of all, is this a total 14 million for both the TIF that comes earlier and CHIP? That's the first question. And the second is, if we skew the approval of TIF towards affordable housing because they have a lower expected growth rate and less impact, that 14 should go farther, right?
So the answer to the first is this applies exclusively to CHIP. So this isn't speaking to existing TIF districts. The answer to the second is accepting your hypothetical. That makes sense to me. But you're saying that the financing on each project would be reduced because the increment that you would actually receive would be reduced as described on the effects yesterday. And so you could have more projects because they're receiving less increment. But it would depend on the scope of the project, right? If you had a larger project, it might not have the same effect. So I think it's to be seen what that effect would be.
On this, so we had the conversation yesterday too about, if you do the 1 cent over 25 years, that's 347 million, whatever it is. If in 1 year, Pepsi approves $10 million, does that $4 million go anywhere? Or is it just forfeited in terms of that?
It would just be forfeited, right? This is an annual amount. So if you didn't hit it in the year, you just didn't hit the cap. I mean, it's just a cap.
Okay.
I don't know if I get why you use the word forfeit, but you're not giving up.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yep.
I think the concept was that the 14 million is cumulative of all of the CHIP programs commitments on the increment.
Yes.
Yes, so it's cumulative. It's not like we're gonna do 14 million new every year.
Right, but this is an annual amount. So in each year you have up to 14 million. Just
Right, with all the existing projects and any new ones.
Okay, this is saying shall not approve per year. So it is not asking in each year,
Right.
how much are we losing per year? It's saying each year you can only approve a new 14 mil. It's not, at least as currently drafted. I may have
So I think
misunderstood
it
the
needs a
concept.
little,
Yeah, we'll need
Yep.
to tweak that a little bit.
Okay.
Wait, how are we tweaking it then?
So it should, the concept had been the cumulative of the CHIP projects would be, the tax increment impact would be a total of 14 million
In any given year?
ever. So that's
So-
the cap.
Okay, so it's just not an annual cap.
It's not an annual cap, it's the cap.
Oh.
So that if you approved 6 million in year one and 6 million in year two, your total is 12, right? So in any given year, you're unlikely to hit the cap because you're,
And it's a matter of just doing the math to figure out what does 14 million in increment actually equal in terms of incremental value? So we'll have to go through that math later to show what that means, because it's a much bigger number.
yes.
I'm not opposed to that, but I feel like what we talked about yesterday was basically 1 cent per year for 25 years for a total of that's where the $347 million in potential exposure came from. I'm not opposed to like the structure you just laid out. I just don't think it's what we talked about yesterday.
let's
Debate that.
debate that later.
Yep, that's right.
Through the
Yep.
bill.
That sounds great. I'm gonna briefly address one of the comments from yesterday on the board related to changing when the OTV is set. I wanted to call out that the approach here is different from TIF districts, where the approved creation would occur at the time the muni approves the district, meaning that your OTV is set at an earlier date. In this draft, the OTV is set upon VEPSI approval of financing. So if a project came with permits in hand at the time of its application, that value should be reflected in the setting of the OTV for that project. So I'm just calling out the way the OTV is set here accounts for a future setting of the OTV as against the way that it's set for TIF districts, meaning it is more protective in the way that's being described of the ed fund.
When does the clock start?
The clocks, so there's multiple clocks, but the creation would happen upon VEPSI approval, that starts your debt incursion clock. So it would be when the financing plan is, when the application is approved by Betsy, and then your retention period starts upon incurrence of first debt. Almost there. Education property tax increment, shift from 70% down to 60% was one of the proposals I'd heard yesterday.
And folks, that was from Representative Feltus, who's not here today, but is, I asked to sort of, I know that she was looking at what an increment that she was comfortable with would be. And so when, we're emailing, and so I will update everyone when I hear back.
And something to note here is it produces a greater gap between your incentivized conduct, right? So now you have a 20% gain if you pursue an affordable project. If you. Adjustment of percentage, we have a mechanism built in for downward amending the percentage if your financing is being adequately covered by the increment to this point, right? That had been a 10-year check-in. This is now a 5-year check-in. So if after 5 years, Pepsi determines you're getting more increment than you need to cover your financing, and they could reduce that percentage and still cover your cost of financing. They have the authority to do that. Okay. Rulemaking. This is giving some specific directives as to what Betsy needs to do when adopting rules. So they need to adopt rules for prioritization of applications. This is tied to setting that cap. To take into consideration a number of things I saw up on the board. Purposes of section 1907, vacancy rates, stagnancy, light regional equity, and proximity to job centers. And then they would also need to determine that appropriate categorization of floor areas and what counts as floor area for purposes of the project criteria.
I had some things to add there, but do I wait till?
I got something to think.
And here are your updates to the board. We have new membership. So one, it doesn't have to be personal. There can be designees. You still have state treasurer, VHFA, but now you have VHCB, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Department of Housing and Community Development. You still have the Vermont Bond Bank, Vermont Council on Rural Development, a representative of the regional planning commissions, and the executive director of the Vermont School Boards Association. And then I've updated the duties to pick up that subsection C where we're talking about in the Betsy application. So analysis of the purpose and doing the Buck 4 test. I did want to flag, green highlight is me expressing questions or confusion. The board shall meet upon request. You're going to need to change this. So just flag if they're a regular part of every application process. Lastly, just trying to be sensitive to time, expansion of location criteria, January 1, 2028. This would add areas designated tier 2. Should last the third.
And Representative Higley and Campfield, I know you guys were sort of thinking on that last night, so we left it there, waiting your suggestion.
It just asked that when you say pursuant to and then the statutory reference, you're saying that it would kick in when that time frames in the other section related to tier 2.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it wouldn't be available as a category until. Thank you.
Thank
That was kind of amazing. Thank you. That was amazing, John.